This afternoon, our first speaker is going to be Dr. John King. He's a professor of tree physiology and ecosystem science in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. His research focuses on how changes in environmental conditions due to land change, variation in climate and hydrology, and biotic stress affect forest physiology and productivity, and the implications for forest management and ecosystem services provisioning. And he's going to talk to us about forest stewardship. So take it away, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of this webinar. And I have a lot of slides today. I'm going to step through them pretty quickly with the idea that, yes, I want to present a lot of material, cover a lot of ground, but also this webinar is going to be recorded. And if you want to go back over something that I go through quickly, you can always go back to the webinar and refer to specific slides for more information. And also feel free to contact me at NC State at any time. I'm pretty easy to look up within their system. So I was tasked with speaking about forest stewardship, which is a very broad area and topic. Basically what I'd like to do is talk first about physiology, forest physiology, and how that relates to the cycling of carbon and water. Then talk about factors that affect carbon assimilation and water use in forest ecosystems. And this will really be focusing on a lot of the projects we do in my lab, our areas of interest. Then talk a little bit at the end about forest management as a tool for adaptation based on what I call spatially explicit ecophysiology. And then finally some closing thoughts on moving forward. Okay, so first part of the talk. If you remember back to your undergraduate biology class or plant physiology class, carbon and water cycles are linked at the sub-leaf scale, really. You know, here we have a micrograph of some leaf stomata. This is where CO2 enters the leaf and water exits the leaf. So those two processes occur simultaneously, continuously, as long as the leaf is photosynthesizing and transpiring. Okay, and they're related by this equation down here. This is Fick's first law of diffusion, which basically states that the rate of diffusion is proportional to a diffusion coefficient times the difference in concentration between the outside of the leaf and the inside of the leaf over the path length, this distance here. Okay, so if we increase the concentration of CO2 in the air, like we are with pollution, then that forces this to a higher level of photosynthetic process, which we call CO2 fertilization. Okay. Once the CO2 is inside the leaf, of course, it's transformed by the light and the dark reactions of photosynthesis into the sugars, which are the endpoint of photosynthesis and the building blocks for everything else the plant does. Okay. So at the very smallest level, even the molecular level, the cycling of water and carbon are intricately linked in forest ecosystems. That brings us to the next scale, though, the scales of the tree, the ecosystem, and the region. Okay, we have what we could call the tree or forest carbon cycle, where the canopy as a whole is taking up carbon in photosynthesis, something we call gross primary production. And at the same time, plants are always respiring, just like we are, so they lose CO2 continuously. Some of the carbon finds its way into wood and other long-lived storage pools, and then through litter inputs from foliage and fine roots, it finds its way into the soil carbon cycle, which we've heard about at some of the other talks in this webinar. Okay, and there's varying residence times of carbon in soil, but it's the largest pool of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems and some of the longest lived. So, as in agriculture, what happens in the soil regarding carbon is very, very important. At the same time, there's the tree and forest water cycle. Trees are always transpiring. They're always taking up water, most of the time taking up water from the soil for their growth and physiological processes, and then it's released to the atmosphere through the process of transpiration, both evaporation and transpiration. Okay, and this process, the forest hydrologic cycle, is driven by the forest energy balance. Okay, and radiation impacts the forest in both short and long wavelengths. It's absorbed, a certain fraction of it is absorbed, and it's re-radiated back to the atmosphere in both short and long wave forms. Okay, so we have the carbon, water, and energy cycling that's continuously and simultaneously occurring in all forests, and these are affected, the rates of which are affected by the stage of stand development. So we have young agrading forest act differently than juvenile forest, which act differently than mature forest, and they act differently than old growth forest. Okay, and then these are in some kind of equilibrium or dynamic transition with other forms of land use and urbanization. So ideally, what we would like to do is understand the ecophysiological process rates for each of these stages and scale that to the landscape based on these other, the proportion of the landscape that's in each one of these land use forms. That's a pretty tall wish list. We're working on that actively, but there's a lot of universities, a lot of people around the world working on that, but it's a pretty tall wish list. Okay, forests serve, among other things, to protect the climate and make it more comfortable for people. And people are starting to look at this a little bit more seriously, for reasons of adapting to climate change, but also for designing cities for comfort and energy efficiency and cost effectiveness. And here, this cartoon, we have a depiction of a grassland type ecosystem and a forest, and the yellow arrow or orange arrow represents a direct reflection of sunlight back into the atmosphere. Blue is evaporation, and the red would be the sensible heat flux, the heat that you can feel. And in these systems, you have they're highly reflective. They have a high albedo. A lot of the energy is reflected directly back into space or the atmosphere, and you have a lesser amount in transpiration or evaporation from the surface, and about the same amount as sensible heat. In a forest, you have much more of the energy is absorbed. They have a lower albedo, a lower reflectivity. They absorb a lot more solar radiation, and a lot of that energy, I would argue with this cartoon, in that this blue arrow should be even larger. A lot of that energy is transmitted back to the atmosphere as water vapor, latent heat, and so you don't feel it. It actually serves to cool the landscape surface. And it stimulates the hydrologic cycle. Here you have the big cloud as opposed to the small cloud. So forests actually process or cycle energy and water in a fundamentally different way from an agricultural field or a grassland system, for example. And you can see that in these data. These are albedo of different types of systems, and forests, especially pine forests, have the lowest albedo. So they absorb the most energy and proportionally cycle the most back to the atmosphere as latent heat. So you get the shade from the trees, you get this evaporative cooling from the trees, and that serves to make our cities more comfortable, and also it moderates the climate through the hydrologic cycle, that transfer of energy to the atmosphere. Okay, some more data showing the reflectivity of different vegetated surfaces. Down here in the lower right-hand corner, we can see in the southeast U.S., the albedos are very low compared to other regions that have, at higher latitudes, you have more snow and ice and more reflectivity. In our area, we don't have as much, so our reflectivity is lower. But nonetheless, we see that croplands have the highest reflectivity, and again, evergreen forests have the lowest. So again, determining what kind of vegetation we deploy across the landscape, that has a huge effect on the energy balance of the region, and again, feeds back into climate and also our immediate comfort levels. The issue, some people have brought up the argument that if we want to adapt to climate change or help mitigate climate change, we should plant forests everywhere because forests lock up carbon. Scientists have been thinking about this and have forwarded the argument that, well, if you are going to use forests to sequester carbon, then you need to account for the cost in water through increased transpiration. Okay, so these data, especially in the bottom two panels, show the amount of annual precipitation or annual runoff, in this case, as a function of plantation age or forest age. And these data suggest, they're noisy, but they suggest that as you plant more and more forests, the amount of precipitation that's returned to the hydrologic cycle as runoff decreases because it's being evaporated. Okay, so the amount of water that's available to reservoirs, may be affected by that, and for other purposes. So we always have to think about, trading water for carbon when we think about large spread forest planting, for whatever reason. Just to compare forest and agricultural systems in a few ways. This table I worked on most of yesterday. It's hard to believe that these kind of data are this hard to find. And that's an argument that I want to make today, a point that I want to make today. We need to start studying these systems, whether they're agricultural or forestry, in much more detail so we can understand how the different forms of management and species composition, etc., affect the carbon and water relations of these systems. Because we do have to more actively manage the carbon, water, and energy cycles across our landscapes. Okay, so in terms of photosynthesis, there's a lot of numbers here. I just want to highlight on a few of the colored ones. Red colors mean it's going up. Blue colors means it's going down relative to the average within a column. And we see that our agricultural crops, I picked soybean and corn, have very high rates of photosynthesis, very high rates and water flux, stomatal conductance of water vapor. Okay, very high fluxes. These things are very sensitive to changes in the environment, which is why we have to manage their water nutrient availability very carefully. This is water use efficiency, the amount of carbon taken up per water lost at a leaf level. We see that soybeans are the least efficient. Okay, so they may be a little bit more sensitive to drought. In contrast, pine forests have very low rates of photosynthesis, comparatively low rates of stomatal conductance. So they might be a little bit more robust to variations in climatic factors. Our productivity is all over the map. This is above ground net primary production, but it ranges from about 3 to 10 megagrams per hectare per year. For reference, 10 megagrams per hectare per year is about 25 English tons per acre per year. A big difference, and one that we have the most confidence in, might be the amount of carbon that's stored in these different kinds of systems. And we can see for the forest that total live and dead biomass gets upwards of 75 to 100 megagrams metric tons per hectare, whereas in our ag systems it goes way down. Okay, and that includes the soil too. We have much higher soil organic carbon contents in forests, and as we heard from earlier talks today, the more tillage, the more disturbance we do in our ag systems, the less carbon they store. So when we think about integrated carbon management across the landscape, we should always keep in mind the role of forestry and the role of agriculture, and maybe integrating them a little bit more than we have in the past. Okay, so factors that affect carbon assimilation and water use. This is a laundry list that I chose to look at today. So I hope most of us have seen this graph. It's on the left-hand side is what we call the keeling curve. That's the carbon dioxide concentration that's measured continuously since the late 1950s. And this curve is really, I use it more and more as a teaching tool because this personalizes the whole issue of climate change. I was born in 1962, okay, so the atmospheric concentration was about 315 parts per million when I was born, and now we're well over 400 parts per million. So this basically records or represents the atmospheric CO2 change that's occurred over my lifetime. And I always poll my classes and find out what the average age of my classes is. Then we can look at the same amount of change over time for my students. On the right-hand side, we also see past and projected changes in tropospheric ozone concentration above 60 parts per billion in the summertime. And anything above 60 parts per billion, that's where you really start to see phytotoxic effects. And just due to growth in industry around the world and fossil fuel combustion, it's projected that large areas of the Earth's surface are going to be affected by increasing levels of ozone. Okay, regardless of what's happened in the U.S. As a result of the Clean Air Act. Okay, so we have to think about how the changing quality of the air affects our productivity of our farms and forests. I've been involved with a lot of work on this. This is an example from one of these so-called FACE experiments, free air carbon dioxide enrichment experiment, where using very large exposure technology, we're able to fumigate large patches of forest and look at the growth response over time. And just to zero you in on some typical results, these are from aspen and birch forest in the upper Midwest. We see under controlled conditions, these forests accumulated about 4,000 grams per meter square of carbon at age 6 or 7 or so. Okay, and this is typical for the region. When we expose the forest to elevated CO2 expected for the year about 2050, we got about a 40% stimulation in productivity, maybe not quite that high, 38% stimulation productivity. Conversely, when we gave them a background of 60 parts per billion ozone, we lost about 22% productivity. And then significantly, when we fumigated the trees with both gases at the same time, the productivity was not different from control. So the positive effects of elevated CO2 were completely offset by the negative effects of ozone. Okay, and these results seem to be pretty universal. We've looked at this in different forests around the world, different species composition, and they all seem to fall on this line. So we get about an 18% stimulation in net primary production at CO2 levels predicted for about the year 2050. These results do taper off as the forests become more mature and competition sets in, and resource availabilities in the soil decline. So we think we can benefit from some stimulation early in stand development, and there are still processes that occur in the older forests that are important too. In terms of water use, stomata respond to the elevated CO2 concentration by closing. Some people used to think that that would cause a great savings in the amount of water, and we do get that at the leaf level. But when we look at it at the stand level, again, this is for 2 different years. This is the volumetric soil water content over the course of the summer. Excuse me. And this is the effect of the treatments. These lines are due to elevated CO2, this is the control, I guess, or this is the control. The flat line is the control, elevated ozone and CO2 plus ozone. And really, there's not much change due to these gases in volumetric soil water content, and that's because leaf area changes at the same time, and that offsets any stomatal responses. We've looked at the effect of elevated CO2 and ozone on litter biochemistry, foliage, and fine roots, and their decomposition. And a lot of numbers here, but the thing to focus on is most of these factors are non-significant. Okay, and so we don't change the litter quality of the plant material too much, and as a consequence, its processing in the soil by microbes does not really change. So any changes in carbon storage due to elevated CO2 or ozone, for that matter, are going to be really driven by NPP and the proportional litter inputs. These bottom panels are microbial respiration as a function of the amount of litter input due to the different treatments. And basically, if you give the microbes more substrate, they're more active. If you give them less substrate, they're less active. And then you combine that with the physical capacity and chemical capacity of soils to store carbon, and that's really what's going to determine carbon storage in ecosystems. In terms of temperature, this is a little bit of a dated slide, but I looked at one last night that was up to date to 2015, and this trend continues. So relative to a long-term average, there's no question that the global climate is warming. And we're seeing not just this in the temperature record, but there's encroachment of shrubs up into the Arctic, where we've never seen woody plants before. The cryosphere is melting. This is a picture of Lake Superior that I snatched off a webcam in 2008. This lake used to freeze up thick enough that you could drive cars across it, and that's not happening nowadays. As well as the melting of the poles and the continental glaciers. So it's indisputable. What we need to think about, though, in terms of forest management and agriculture, is that temperature, water availability, and what we call vapor pressure deficit are linked. Okay, and we did a comparison of 16 global circulation models, and basically, the thing in the environment that determines water availability is the ratio of precipitation to potential evapotranspiration. You really need to think about both of these quantities when you're thinking about agriculture and forestry. and anything below 0.6, you're starting to talk about you need to irrigate if you're going to grow anything. Okay, so above that, the bluer you get, the more water available. This is the current distribution of precipitation to PET across the globe. This is how we project climate to, or the temperature to change roughly by 2065. And the hotter the colors, the more warming is going to occur. So again, up at the higher latitudes, we have a lot of confidence in this. Really, the darker the shade of the color, the more confidence we have. So it's going to get a lot warmer, especially at the high latitudes. And you can think about how that's going to affect the distribution of natural and managed ecosystems. Water availability, our models are not as accurate. We don't have as much confidence, although there is good agreement for certain parts of the world. Unfortunately, not the southeast. For whatever reason, the models have a hard time predicting what's going to happen with water availability, precipitation in the U.S. southeast, some other parts of the world. Water availability at the high latitudes again is going to increase. So again, you can think that agriculture and forestry activity is going to shift to higher latitudes. And then this last panel is a modified drought severity index. And basically, where it's already hot and dry, it's going to get hotter and drier. And across Europe, across the eastern U.S., the drought stress is predicted or projected to increase significantly. So we really need this is this is why it's so important that we have a better understanding of carbon, water, and energy relationships in all of our managed ecosystems. Here's the distribution of productivity around the world for tree and grass systems. And this is another projection of water limitation that's going to occur in the future. Independent analysis from the one I just showed. So again, in many important regions of the world, it's going to be harder to grow food and to grow fiber. And continuing this research, Department of Energy has what they call the Spruce Project. This is, as far as I know, the last large-scale elevated CO2 experiment. And they're doing it in a black spruce ecosystem in Canada because there's a lot of carbon stored up here. And as we talked about, this is where a lot of the projected change is going to occur. So they want to see what the potential is for the carbon that's locked up in the trees and the soil here to feed back to the climate under future conditions. And they really cranked it up. I mean, they're pushing this one really hard with 900 ppm CO2 and plus 9 degrees C. A little bit closer to home, we also have to concern, we have to think about not just global climate change that occurs over decades to centuries. We need to think about how forests and farms respond to annual variation, interannual variation. And many of you will remember back to 2007 when we had an epic drought in this part of the country. And the reservoirs, the surface water here dried up. The cities were getting down to a number of days of being without water before it started raining in the fall. So this is a recurring thing that farmers have known about it all along and have dealt with it all along. And it's but again, a more mechanistic understanding of how our ecosystems work is needed so that we can manage and adapt to these changes. In collaboration with the Forest Service and others, we are part of a global monitoring network. So it's called FluxNet, and there's these research sites, monitoring sites all over the world, and each one of these measures about a square mile of area. So it looks like a lot of dots around the world, but then you think about it, we're intensively monitoring 500 square miles over the surface of the Earth. It's still very, very low coverage, and more is needed. Again, what we do at these sites is we look at the relationship of carbon, water, and energy cycling at a forest level. And we have several of these sites in eastern North Carolina in both managed pine and in unmanaged natural hardwoods. And one of the sites is at the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in Dare County. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a very good collaborator with this work. Located in eastern North Carolina, and as you know, the sea is rising. We get the periodic storms, and the temperature is changing. So this provides a very good natural laboratory for studying the kind of things we want to study. These towers, these sites consist of a meteorological tower where we collect information on meteorology, precipitation, temperature, energy dynamics, also the exchange of water vapor and carbon between the atmosphere and the land surface. And basically, this technology allows us to see the forest breathing, when it's taking in CO2, when it's giving off CO2. This is a forested wetland, so we also monitor methane. Methane is another important greenhouse gas and part of the carbon cycle. We use allometric methods for estimating overstory and understory net primary production, so we can see how fast the forest is growing. We also measure with a lot of duress. This is not an easy place to study, and anybody who's worked on soils knows that the soils are not easy to study, and when they're underwater, they're even harder. So we get a lot of complaints from students and postdocs about bugs and fighting the swamp and bears and whatnot, but it's what you have to do. We look at the decay of the organic material, and at the end of the day, we put all these different parts together to come up with a carbon balance, a water balance, and an energy balance for each year that we study it. These are example data from Alligator River. So our gross ecosystem productivity, the amount of carbon taken up by the forest in 1 year, is about equal to 1,453 grams per meter square. 1,397 is lost as ecosystem respiration, and of that, 440 comes from the soil. And our net ecosystem exchange, that is the amount of carbon that's gained or lost by the forest, in this case, is about 56 grams of carbon per meter square per year. So it's not a huge carbon sink, but it is still a positive carbon sink. We contrast that with our managed pine forest, do the same kind of analysis. There's a lot of disturbance here. The sites are ditched and drained so that you can grow these upland tree species. There's a lot of disturbance of the organic matter in the soil that causes decomposition, and so we have a much higher GEP. The forest is capturing much more carbon because these are younger, more vigorously growing trees. They respire more, okay, and the soil respiration is much higher. And our net ecosystem exchange is about 600 grams of carbon per meter square per year. But it's significant to note that this is only going to be the case while these trees are growing so fast. The soil disturbance is resulting in losing about 100 grams per meter square per year. So all in all, the soil component appears to be losing carbon, and that's not well understood across the Southeast, and something that needs to be. We just need to think about that. We also are involved with projects where we look at the effects of drought on forest productivity, carbon sequestration, and water use. Drought, as we saw earlier, that's of current and future importance. So there's a lot of work that goes into this, and we look at this in managed pine. We look at it in novel forest use as well, such as bioenergy. And we do this using a very simple technology. We just use rain gutter that you would find on somebody's house, and we intercept a certain fraction of the rainfall that would hit the soil, and then we channel it off of the plots. Okay, and then we look at the effects on productivity and physiology. And again, everything we do relates carbon and water. We look at the productivity, the effects on productivity, but also if you look at this slide, this is the stand before we coppiced it, before we harvested it, and then this is after. Sycamore comes back with a vengeance, and the leaf area is amazing. It shades out all its competitors, all the competing weeds, and so it has a lot of potential for bioenergy production. But again, we need to understand the implications on water use of this system, and so we're studying these actively. At the same time, in North Carolina, we have to think about flooding. This on the right-hand side, you can see basically a projection of a sea level rise of about 1 meter. This is the amount of land in eastern North Carolina, at least northeastern North Carolina, that would be flooded under a 1 meter sea level rise. So basically, this is about where the Suffolk Scarp is. Okay, so anything below that, whenever this 1 meter occurs, is going to be underwater. So anybody, in Dare County, Tyrell County, Washington County, flooding, again, you have that with hurricanes in a short-term scenario, but also as the sea rises, we've got to think about it in terms of long-term change. and how do we respond to that with our farming and our forestry. This is a very common scene when you're driving down in eastern North Carolina, and frankly all up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, I'm sure. Trees are dying, and a lot of people don't understand why, but it's often associated with ditches, roadside ditches, which most roads have a roadside ditch in this part of the world, and so we need to understand that. Here's another projection of what's going to happen to mainland Dare County with 22 inches in sea level rise. This is not the meter, the controversial 1 meter level. This is just 22 inches. A lot of Dare County, if this occurs by 2100, a lot of Dare County is going to go away. And in fact, this whole area here is the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, our partners, and you know, again, this is a very common sight here. You know, if you're driving down there, you're going to the beach with your family or whatever. If you see trees standing in water, you know, stop to think about what that might mean. Pond pine is a very important component. This is a veg map of the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, and all the yellow indicates pond pine. We're studying the effects of changing hydrology at the northern part of the refuge, among other things here. Okay, so we measure pond pine ecosystem carbon content as a function of distance from the water's edge. We want to look at the effects of salinity, groundwater hydrology, and storm surges. We compare the roadside to the ditch side to understand the effect of that engineering on the system. And we quantify the carbon in all the major components, the soils, the trees, the understory and midstory shrubs, and herbaceous plants. Okay, this is in the northern part of the refuge. Here's our transect that's on the far side. This is the ditch side. And all this gray area that you see in this image, this is a Google image that I collected not too long ago. All this gray area is dead and dying forest. It's a very widespread phenomenon. All this yellow area is marshland, okay? And then the dark green area is still healthy forest. So it's a system that's rapidly in transition, and we're trying to figure out, or trying to understand the changes that are occurring there. I had a master's student working on here for the last 2 years at this particular site, again taking the carbon inventory of the different components of the system, and we're in the process of analyzing those data now. We took particular care to quantify the organic carbon in the soil, all the way down to the mineral soil. And in the this is Chase, my master's student who graduated this December. In the process of sampling the soils, we kept coming across these layers of wood buried, meters under the surface. We're in the process. This is out of Chase's thesis, and we basically just to show that we've quantified the carbon in all the plant components. And we need to, I don't have time today to go through these numbers in detail and describe what they mean, but we're profoundly changing, or the changes in the hydrology are profoundly changing the carbon storage and the structure of these ecosystems. But nobody's quantified it till now. One of the interesting things is we're finding a lot of carbon in a lot of wood in the soil, the organic soil, and it's occurring in layers, okay? And we're carbon dating this, C14 dating this. And our dates go back to almost 2,000 years in different layers by depth. It's proportional to depth. The deeper you go, the older the wood is, okay? And we've identified these to species using wood anatomy. And so we know that this site hosted upland forest 2,000 years ago. And so it's been experiencing sea level rise. We have that chronology that we're going to report on this spring. So the currently dying pond pine forest indicates the system is moving from a stable state into a stage of transition, which has occurred at this site many times, or several times over the past 2,000 years. The roadside ditches accelerate the process, and the carbon that has been stably sequestered for millennia is being mobilized. So we need to understand where it's going. Weaving the understanding of the biophysical and ecological responses of coastal ecosystems into past and current social context will enrich people's awareness of where they live. It will enhance natural resources management, and we believe it will improve economic well-being. These are all long-term goals that we're working towards, and again, we don't have time to go into how we're addressing each of those. Pests and pathogens is also another important consideration moving forward. This is a map showing the distribution of mountain pine beetle, the historic distribution of mountain pine beetle, and then lodgepole pine, its primary host, and then a related species, jack pine. Okay, that's the distribution across Canada. Okay, and people are seeing increasing depredation by this beetle due primarily to warming winters. The winters aren't getting cold enough to kill the beetles back. Okay, so they overwinter and they expand their range and they're moving further north. And this is the number of areas affected historically. And you know, again, like so many of these ecosystem metrics of change, it looks like we've passed a threshold here. Just a huge change in the functioning of the system. And what people are worried about is that eventually, you know, the beetle will use jack pine, lodgepole pine hybrids as a bridge, get into the jack pine population, and then it's going to spread all the way across Canada. So as bad as the problem is now, there's potential for that to get much, much worse. And we need to think about that also in our region in the southeast. So we work on both native and exotic species of insect pest. Tip moth is one of the primary pests affecting loblolly pine. We've done experiments in the past where we've treated the trees with a systemic insecticide, which provides a couple years of protection at stand establishment, and we've looked at the biomass response. And we did that at an upper coastal plain site, which is on the left here, and then a lower coastal plain site here. And I want to focus on these results now for today's talk. And basically, the response to protection of the trees from the insect, we get 130 to 100 to 225% stimulation in biomass production when we take this bug out of the equation. So managing insects has a huge effect on the physiology, the productivity, and the carbon storage in our forest ecosystems. We also look at exotic pests. We've done some studies on Hemlock woolly adelgid, their effects on the wood, the development of the wood, and what that means for water transport. And basically, the hydrology, the hydraulics of the tree are being compromised by the insect. The wood's not able to transport wood or water as competently as it was before. And if you combine that with a drought stress, for example, that can tip the trees over the edge. So again, we're applying our physiology and our ecological analysis to understanding real-world problems. In the case of the hemlock, we're using models, ecosystem models, to scale up the effects on water cycling at the tree and stand level or watershed level, so we can see what the impact of this insect will be on the hydrology of the area. Okay, and if I didn't mention it in my laundry list, but of course land use change, and especially in the southeast. This is a projection that a couple authors published in the Journal of Forestry in 2005. This is what the area of urbanized landscape looks like in 2000. You know, basically, the redder you get, the more urbanized the landscape. And this is 2050, projection for 2050. You know, if economic development, population growth continues as they have in the recent past, there's going to be a lot more people on a lot less land. And again, everything we do, we need to be more efficient at it and understand how our systems work from a mechanistic point. Okay, and then finally, you know, everything changes every year. Mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, the seasonality of temperature precipitation, you know, when the rain falls, when it's cold, when it's hot, whether insects are prevalent or not, you know, ice and storms, air and water quality, market conditions change, politics change, and policy frameworks change. So we have this mosaic of constantly changing conditions under which we have to manage our forests and our farms. So, okay, so I got about 5 more minutes. So, forest management as a tool for adaptation. Okay, so you know, this is where I think we need to go. You know, along with a lot of other developments, but we need to use we need to make ecophysiology an applied science. Some of what we do is developing new bioenergy cropping systems. The picture on the lower right shows traditional loblolly pine plantation in Lenoir County, North Carolina. And in between the rows, instead of having weeds that have to be sprayed or trapped, which is the usual practice, with our industry collaborators, Weyerhaeuser, we tried to plant switchgrass to see if we could get an energy crop with all this land that happens to be in between the trees. And again, we're studying the productivity of the grass and the trees together and the impacts on water cycling of this new system. And in the progress of this work, we did a review of the literature to find out how much was known about productivity and water use of the major crop species, tree crop species, and grasses that could be used for bioenergy. We scoured the literature. We looked at almost 400 studies, and we found very few data, complete data, on any of these things: photosynthesis to model conductance, water use efficiency, even productivity, and even less so for stand level transpiration, okay, and bioenergy water use efficiency. How many megajoules of energy are you getting per cubic meter of water transpired? So we really need to do a better job of spatially explicit representation of forest and ag land biotic structure, species composition, age, class structure, etc., and process rates, and link that to climate-driven models so that we can integrate the effects of these land use systems at the regional and national scale. Some ways to do that, another area, in addition to better ecophysiology, genetics and breeding and species selection. Traditional tree breeding has been limited to growth, stem form, disease resistance, mainly for economic return, greater economic return. We need to combine molecular and traditional approaches to design purpose-grown trees with traits for specific purposes, for bioenergy, for example. We need to better match genetics to site conditions, the so-called G by E interactions. Genetics by environment, we need to exploit that. We need to breed or engineer climate-robust varieties. Almost nothing is known about that. Breed or engineer greater resistance to pests and pathogens. There's a lot of hope for this, a lot of potential, and it may be the only way to address these threats at a regional scale. And we need to select new and overlooked species for a variety of uses. One example that we work with is sycamore for bioenergy. It's got a lot of potential, but it's not on anybody's radar except for ours. And genetics may be one of the most effective, sustainable, and economical methods to enhance ecosystem services precision. Once you have the improved genetics, then they do the work on the landscape. There's a lot of opportunities with silviculture, in terms of age, stand structure, and managing fertility. Regeneration silviculture needs to become as precise and reliable as establishing a farm field. This is especially challenging for most hardwood species. Genetics, as I said, needs to be used as a part of silviculture to increase tolerance to climate, pests, and pathogens, and also to achieve greater nutrient use efficiency and water use efficiency. Maintaining younger age classes and healthier, more vigorous forests may decrease some pest problems. This is why some people think the problem of southern pine beetle is not as bad as it used to be in the 80s. The pine forests are managed much more intensively now. They're younger age classes, they're more vigorous, and you don't hear about pine beetle as much as you used to in the south. Related, thinning may increase resilience to drought, pests, and decrease fire risk. You have younger, more vigorous trees and fewer of them, so they're using the site resources in a better way. Fertilization has potential as long as it's economically viable, but it should be used with caution to avoid negative environmental effects, and it also has been implicated in increasing vulnerability to certain biotic and abiotic stresses. And again, we don't have time to go into what they are, but it's a tool, but it needs to be used wisely. Okay, and then finally, I think we need to integrate forestry and agriculture more than we have in the past. Use bioenergy as an example, bioenergy intercropping. That allows for economic diversification. Rural economic development that's the place to do it. It's where the society is structured for harvesting, handling, and processing biomass. We need to integrate bioenergy cropping with agriculture. To do that, more research is needed. The markets have to be there, and it has the potential to add product streams for farmers. Okay, so this is the economic realm. In terms of the soil realm and the biodiversity realm, if we have short rotation crops like these poplar here, We have impacts on soil organic carbon, soil nutrients, soil structure, perhaps soil pests and pathogens. This will increase the biodiversity of agricultural landscapes, and it may improve the climate profile of agricultural landscapes, again, through carbon, water, and energy cycling pathways. From a regional and a national carbon balance perspective and impacts on water, there would be benefits of fossil fuel offsets, energy security, carbon sequestration in soils, and again, we must understand the effects on regional water cycling. So, this is just an example of better integration of agriculture and forestry. That I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And to get there, we need partnerships. We need partnerships between academia, where we do the research and development of products and processes. We train the professionals, for the next generation, and we educate the public. We need to do a better job of this so that there's not so much debate about the science. We need help from government, to fund our research, to have environmental regulation and policy, establish policy that's grounded in science. And we need the private sector to help. They help fund our work. They have funded it in the past. They contribute important operational knowledge, the deployment, and they're a big part of socially responsible economic development. So it's it's not us and them. It's all of us together that we have to start working on this. So that's all I have today, and I appreciate your time.